convene us. For those I don't know, I'm Sandro Galea, and I have the privilege of serving as Dean of the School of Public Health at Boston University. And on behalf of the school, before today's event, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, a quick thank you to the members of our community who make today possible, particularly Meredith Brown and the team. Thank you. Last month, we hosted a symposium on how systemic racism undermines public health. It was an excellent symposium. It was part of our engagement with the series of commemorations that have become called for 100 Years of Inequality, national movement marking the anniversary of slavery in America. Today's event, in many ways, continues this engagement as part of that series. Reparations is a complex and controversial topic in the public conversation, and that is exactly why we're discussing it. From our perspective, it's important to public health that we find the tough solutions to challenges that are important to the health of the public. Honestly facing our history can help create a healthier world in the here and now. Leading the conversation is Professor William Sandy Darity. He's the Samuel DuBois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African American Studies and Economics, and Director of the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. I'm very much looking forward to learning from him today. Here to introduce Professor Darity and to tell us about the day is our Assistant Dean of Diversity and Inclusion, Professor Yvette Cozier. Yvette.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today we are joined by a noted scholar in the area of Black reparations, Dr. William A. Darity, Jr. Dr. Darity is the Samuel DuBois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies and Economics, and the Director of the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. Dr. Darity's research focuses on inequality by race, class and ethnicity, stratification economics, schooling and the racial achievement gap, the economics of reparations, the history of economics, and the social psychological effects of exposure to unemployment. He is the co-author of the forthcoming book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, and he lives with his family in Durham, North Carolina, where he plays harmonica in a local blues band. I think it's awesome, and occasionally coaches youth sports, and especially enjoys reading science fiction and speculative fiction. Thank you, Dr. Darity, for being here today. But before we bring him to the stage, I'd like to also introduce our moderator for this afternoon, Dean Harold Cox. He is the Associate Dean for Public Health Practice and the Associate Professor for Community Health Sciences at Boston University School of Public Health. Dean Cox directs the Activist Lab at BU School of Public Health, which engages the school community in real-world advocacy to drive lasting improvements in the health of our local, regional, and global communities. Dean Cox is the recipient of numerous awards, including the American Public Health Association's Milton and Ruth Romer Prize for Creative Local Public Health, the Rebecca Lee Award for Outstanding Commitment to Public Health from the Mass Department of Public Health, and the Paul Revere Award for Outstanding Public Health Service. In the spring of 2018, Boston Mayor Marty Walsh declared April 12th Harold Cox Day in the city of Boston in recognition of Dean Cox's contributions to public health in Greater Boston. So at this time, I'd like to bring Professor Darity to the podium.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. I'd like to begin my conversation with you about reparations with a definition. Reparations is restitution for a grievous injustice, for atrocities visited upon a victimized community. In general, reparations should accomplish three objectives. These objectives are classified under the acronym ARC, A-R-C. First, acknowledgement. Second, redress. And third, closure. Acknowledgement is the recognition on the part of the culpable party that they have committed such a grievous injustice, and simultaneously, the recognition that the culpable party has benefited from the execution of these atrocities. Redress is restitution, which is central to any reparations program. And finally, closure means that the victimized community and the culpable party come to an agreement that the debt has been paid. I want to be clear, though. Payment of the debt does not necessarily mean forgetting the conditions that led to the necessity of the payment of the debt. And in fact, one of the themes of much of the work that I've been doing on the design of a reparations program is that an important aspect of the reparations program must be the work of maintaining memory and creating an accurate memory of what took place that prompted the creation of the reparations program. So now I want to talk specifically about reparations for Black Americans. And here I want it to be clear that there is a particular community of Black Americans who are the relevant targets for a reparations program. And these are Black descendants of American slavery. So in the work that I've been doing with Kirsten Mullen, my co-author on the book that was mentioned, we have established two criteria for eligibility for reparations. The first criteria is an individual must demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. The second criteria is an individual must demonstrate that for at least 10 years before the adoption of a reparations program or the adoption of a study commission for the purposes of exploring a reparations program, they self-reported their race as Black, Negro, or African American. So it's those two criteria in conjunction that must be used for identifying who the eligible recipients are. This is the community of Americans who specifically have had to carry the burden of the failure to provide restitution to the formerly enslaved at the end of the Civil War. That is to say, this is the community of Americans whose ancestors were denied the promised 40 acres and a mule at the close of the Civil War. This in turn led to a constituent process where across generations, wealth denial and wealth deprivation continued to the point that I'm going to describe the magnitude of the existing racial wealth gap in a moment or two. But let me say this, the deprivation of the 40 acres was essentially a consolidation of the failure to provide the formerly enslaved with full citizenship. So I will argue that the citizenship claim that is being made by Black descendants of American slavery is one that can only be fulfilled adequately with the adoption of a reparations program. Therefore, reparations is a precondition for full citizenship for Black Americans. Now, what are the array of atrocities that are relevant, or what is the array of atrocities? I get my tenses mixed up here. What is the array of atrocities that's relevant to the case for reparations? Well, let me start by saying that it's a misnomer to refer to slavery reparations. Slavery is certainly an important dimension of the case for reparations. Slavery is the crucible that created America's version of white supremacy, but it is not the only reason for reparations. And I emphasize this particularly in light of some comments that were made by our current Senate Majority Leader. So of course, the history of slavery is relevant to the reparations case, and it has an important relevance. But we also must pay attention to nearly 100 years of legal segregation and racial terror in the United States, what we put under the label of the Jim Crow regime. And we also have to pay attention to the atrocities that have taken place in the post-Civil Rights Act era. These include racialized mass incarceration, police executions of unarmed Blacks, the persistence of credit, housing, and employment discrimination, and from my perspective as an economist, one of the most compelling dimensions of America's current wave of atrocities, the persistence of the racial wealth gap. And I think we have to take into account slavery, the Jim Crow era, and the post-civil rights era from the standpoint of evaluating the cumulative effects of these atrocities on living Black Americans. These effects are generational or intergenerational, and they are associated with a recognition that the origins of the existing racial wealth gap finds itself in the intergenerational transmission effects that are associated with the deprivation and denial of property in earlier generations of Black Americans. Indeed, I would add that it's important to recognize what the magnitude of this disparity is. Black Americans constitute approximately 13% of the nation's population, but possess less than 3% of the nation's wealth. If we were going to have a situation in which we had equalization of wealth across blacks and whites in the United States, it would require the provision of an additional $10 to $12 trillion to Black Americans. And I think it's critical that we recognize that these types of disparities are entirely due to intergenerational processes, adverse intergenerational effects for Black Americans, rather than dysfunctional behavior on the part of Black Americans. So let me provide you with three illustrations of arguments that people conventionally make about why we have this immense racial wealth gap. One argument that's frequently made is it's because Black Americans have lower levels of education than white Americans. Well, that's really not borne out by looking at the facts. Black heads of households with a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of white heads of households who never finished high school. Another argument that's frequently made is that it's attributable to the excessive presence of female-headed families in the Black community. But white single-parent families have more than 2 times the net worth of Black 2-parent families. And then another argument that's made is that Black Americans are too profligate. They don't engage in sufficient amount of savings. And so as a consequence that we have this immense racial wealth gap. But if you take into account household income, it turns out that Black and white households with similar levels of income, it's white households that actually spend 1.3 times as much as Black households. And the major reason for that, I would argue once again, is the disproportionate advantage in wealth that is possessed by white households. Now, I also, given the nature of the audience and the location, I want to talk about some of the implications for health disparities and the role of health disparities as reinforcing the case for Black reparations. My focus or emphasis has typically been on wealth inequality as opposed to income inequality. And by wealth, I mean the difference between what you own and what you owe, or the net value of your property. And wealth is more of a stock concept, a stock of resources, in contrast with income, which is a flow of resources that for most people is most closely associated with their earnings. So wealth is different. Most of the research that has been done on health disparities has examined the relationship between race, socioeconomic status, and health outcomes. And socioeconomic status conventionally is evaluated by examining an individual or a family's head's occupational status, their income level, or their educational attainment. And there are some peculiarities that arise, some very disturbing peculiarities. For example, if we consider infant mortality, for Black women with the highest level of education, they have the highest infant mortality rates. This is actually, almost a stunning statistic. But for black women with a doctorate or a professional degree, their infant mortality rate is approximately 30 per 1,000 live births. For black women with a master's degree, it's approximately 18 per 1,000 live births. So these are black women who are the most highly educated. They have the worst health outcomes in terms of the survival of their infants. Indeed, their rates of infant mortality not only exceed white rates dramatically at these levels, but their rates exceed those of less educated black women. So is it possible that if we were to take into account wealth, we could better explain these kinds of differentials? I'm not certain, but it's something that's worth exploring and investigating. My expectation is that the gradient that links hypertension rates and various socioeconomic status characteristics probably would not be as separate or distinct for blacks if we were to examine wealth differentials. But again, there's something going on with respect to the way in which black Americans what black Americans are being subjected to in American society that is leading to these types of differentials. So I'm going to start the case for black reparations by saying that a central objective of a reparations program for black America must be closing the racial wealth gap. This must be a priority. Now, I've mentioned the importance of memory work, but memory work would also have to be a consideration, but it's a secondary consideration. Okay? So, what are the precedents for a reparations program of this type? Let me mention 4. The first is the German reparations that were paid to Holocaust victims. The second are the payments that were made to Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during World War II. A third instance are the payments that were made to families who lost loved ones during the 9/11 attacks. And the final example that I want to mention here are the families who lost their children in the gun assault that took place at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Connecticut. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is the time gap between the relevant atrocity and the payment to the victims. So in the case of German reparations to Holocaust victims, the legislation enacting that program of reparations took place approximately 8 years after the end of World War II. The Japanese American reparations took a longer span of time, but essentially 43 years after the incarceration. The 9/11 payments took place in less than a year after the assaults on the Twin Towers, and the Sandy Hook payments also took place in less than a year after the assault that was made on the school. In all of these cases, 3 of them with the use of government monies. The German case, German government monies, the Japanese American case, and the 9/11 instance, American government monies. In all of these cases, direct payments were made to eligible recipients. Okay? In the Sandy Hook case, there were 2 separate funds. There was a charitable fund where payments were made to the families, and there was another fund that was federal money that was used for other purposes that were supposed to support the community where the attack had taken place. I will note that in terms of charitable contributions, there were some people who gave in kind, and the gifts that they sent typically were toys for children, which is absolutely the most inappropriate thing one could send under those circumstances, and reinforces the belief that has been generated from these other examples that a critical and substantive dimension of any reparations program must be direct payments to the individuals who are the victimized community. So who is culpable for payment of black reparations in the United States? Well, it's the United States government. The reason is the United States government is the source of the law and authority that led to the legal conditions that supported the presence of slavery in the United States, that maintained the Jim Crow regime, and through a process of malign neglect and failure to enforce the laws of the land, led to or contributed to the wave of atrocities that have succeeded the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I want to emphasize then that the focus in my remarks is not on a matter of individual or personal guilt. It is on the matter of national responsibility. Okay? So what form should reparations take? Well, as I suggested from the precedents that I mentioned, it is important that direct payments be made to the victims who are eligible recipients of the funds. I'm open-minded about having multiple uses of a fund for reparations. In some of the earlier work that I've done with Dania Frank, we refer to a portfolio of reparations. But again, for both substantive and symbolic reasons, a central component of a reparations program must be payments that are made to the individuals who form the community that has been subjected to the grievous injustice. Now, another point that I want to emphasize in this context is associated with the growing attention that has been drawn to the recognition on the part of various families, institutions, especially colleges and universities, that they have a history of complicity with slavery. And many of these institutions are, in some shape or form, trying to make some form of restitution. Okay. So I want to say that frequently what happens is the idea is to, as I want to put it, to throw scholarships at the problem. Okay. As I've pointed out, however, highly educated blacks have excuse me, have lower levels of wealth than poorly educated whites. So education is not going to turn the trick in terms of eliminating the racial wealth gap. So, as I also said, this is a matter of national responsibility, not personal or individual guilt. And complicity with slavery is not the only consideration, since, as I pointed out at the beginning of these remarks, it is not slavery alone that forms the foundation for a case for black reparations. Excuse me. I've had this problem all night, so let me take a sip, and maybe that'll help. Okay. But now, even if your focus is exclusively on slavery as the source of guilt, individual acts of restitution cannot encompass the full scope of the harms that have been imposed by specific actors. And here's the key point. Collateral damage to others besides the direct victims of the actions of a particular perpetrator are relevant. And collateral benefits to others besides the direct perpetrators is also relevant. Let me turn specifically to the case of Georgetown University, which has been prominent in the news. As you may know, in 1838, evidence has emerged that the Jesuit priest, sold 272 black people to Louisiana buyers for the purposes of obtaining funds to sustain the university's operations. One of those buyers was the governor of the state of Louisiana, who at the time was in the U.S. House of Representatives when the purchase was made. The Jesuit priests were widely engaged in ownership and sale of slaves, but this particular act of sale had the effect of supporting the continuity of the university. Now, the collateral damages are associated with the fact that this act of participation in the slave trade propagated the system, which affected many, many people beyond the 272 persons who were sold into Louisiana. And certainly the priests did not take any steps to resist or overturn slavery. The collateral beneficiaries include, at minimum, all students who attended Georgetown University. And this is a group of students who overwhelmingly have been white, because the very first black student to be admitted to Georgetown University did not enter the school until 1953. And there were no significant numbers of black students until the 1960s. So the general impact of the actions of an individual perpetrator, like what occurred with Georgetown University, is widely spread across a wide array of victims and beneficiaries. At minimum, these types of acts actually perpetuate a status quo that affords the opportunity for these types of atrocities to continue. So again, as a matter of principle, there's the contextual consideration. For an institution like Georgetown's leaders to have engaged in this kind of act, there needed to be a legal framework that supported the kind of behavior that they were undertaking. And that legal framework is a consequence of the federal government's effective authorization of these types of actions. So I would suggest that institutions that have identified themselves as having a complicitous relationship with slavery, and institutions who feel bad about it, okay, they should do the following. They should form a collaboration to petition and pressure Congress to enact a comprehensive national program of reparations. I think this is far more significant than token gestures like providing additional scholarships or saying we're going to put money into communities where the descendants of folks who we enslaved are currently living. Let's build the full-scale reparations program, and those institutions should engage in that act. So I haven't talked very long, but I'm basically at the end of the core remarks that I want to make today. And then I think we're going to have a full conversation between us. But I mentioned at the beginning that the three primary objectives of a reparations program must be acknowledgement, redress, and closure. And I pointed out that this constitutes the acronym ARC. And you probably are familiar with a quotation that's frequently attributed to Martin Luther King Jr., although I don't think he was the first source of the quotation, where the statement is made, the arc of the moral universe bends long, but it bends toward justice. I think I probably didn't word it exactly right, but I want to argue that the arc of the moral universe must be pushed toward justice. And the push towards justice in the context of the United States must constitute the development and enactment of a national program of reparations that is comprehensive in character. I would add, there are people who run around with these red hats on their heads and that have the initials MAGA on them. So America's failure to provide full citizenship for Black Americans is a failure to constitute this nation as a true democracy. And insofar as that is the case, black reparations are also a prerequisite for making America great for the first time.
Professor Darity, thank you. Quite interesting opening words for us. And there's several points that I think you've given to us. And I should tell you that what we want to do now is to have a conversation with all of you. So start thinking about, what do you think? How does this impact you? What are the questions that you think that we should be asking? What are the questions that you think have not been asked? What's your feeling about this? And I really want to come back to you in a moment and hear some of the things that you're saying. But I take several points away from the things that you've said. One is that as we think about reparations, that it's not only about slavery alone, that there are other components of this, the Jim Crow laws, other kinds of ways that blacks have been impacted. Secondly, that if you have reparations, that it's not enough just to say, I'm sorry, but that it involves some kind of payment. Thirdly, is that as we think about who's responsible, you've identified that it's the government that is culpable, and it's the government that's responsible. And fourthly, you said, if you feel bad about it, then join the conversation in a significant way, as opposed to some nice do-gooder kinds of activities. So I guess my question to you—
You gave my whole speech.
Was that the whole speech? I just want you to know I was listening.
So quickly.
I was listening to what you were saying. So why now? Why are we beginning to have this conversation now? Is this new, or what's happening at this particular time?
So can I give a somewhat
Please.
full answer?
Yeah.
I'll try anyway. So there's a long history of—
I want to pull the microphone a
Sorry.
little closer to you.
There's a long history of conversation about reparations in the black community. But I would argue that we have not had a conversation that has involved national political figures of this magnitude since the Reconstruction era. Now, why that's the case, I'll try to stumble into that in a
Sure.
moment, because I don't have a good answer. But
Especially, I want to know why our politicians suddenly have decided this is an important thing for them to be talking about.
well, I doubt if they decided it was important for them to talk about. I think they've been pushed into having to consider it.
Sure.
But there's been a long tradition of thinking about reparations in the black community. A second case would be the movement that was developed by Callie House, that's described in a superb book by Mary Frances Berry called My Face is Black is True. And Callie House was a woman who took in laundry in Tennessee to make a living. She was never particularly affluent, but somehow she managed to develop a movement that was based upon the idea of the provision of pensions to the formerly enslaved, and assembled a petition that included 300,000 signatures. So the way in which that was sabotaged was by accusing her of mail fraud and then convicting her of mail fraud, which is exactly the same thing that was done to Marcus Garvey subsequently. Okay, and it's the Garvey movement that succeeds the House effort in trying to continue to produce a reparations program. Then we have Queen Mother Audley Moore leading an effort that involved a document that was given to the United Nations in hopes that there would be some type of response there. And then there are organizations like INCOBRA, the National Coalition on reparations for Black Americans. There are organizations like NCOBRA that came into being after Queen Audley Moore's efforts that have tried to sustain the reparations effort. I think perhaps the most significant accomplishment of NCOBRA was their collaboration with the late Congressman John Conyers to introduce and develop House Resolution 40. Unfortunately, not much happened after that. And House Resolution 40 has not been modified, revised, or amended in any significant way since it was first written in 1989, and it does merit revision. But then there was a surge of interest in reparations on college campuses toward the end of the 1990s. And it was such a significant surge in interest that that this guy Horowitz put an advertisement into campus newspapers saying why reparations, Black reparations, was such a bad idea. And he had 10 points that he enumerated in that advertisement. But that activity was stymied by the events of 9/11. And the reparations conversation on college campuses and throughout the country basically disappeared until Ta-Nehisi Coates put out this article in The Atlantic called The Case for Black Reparations. And that kind of revived attention, but it didn't push it to the national stage in the way in which it now appears to be in the national conversation. And so here's my stumbling about why this might be the case now. I think partially it may be kind of a surprising reaction to the extremities of the Trump regime. That there's several kinds of policies that people are now talking about or considering in a more serious way that they're treating as credible in a way that they had not before in response or in reaction to the kind of posturing that's occurred with the Trump regime. So that's one possible explanation. Second is the powerful influence of activists around reparations in the social media world. And I think it's that group of people who in particular have challenged politicians to speak out about reparations. And then on her own accord, it seems, one of the candidates for the presidency, and I think she still is a candidate for the presidency, even though she can't get on the debate stages anymore. But one of the candidates for the presidency has explicitly endorsed reparations, and that's Marianne Williamson. I don't think anybody else has done so to the degree that she has. And I would still complain that the amount that she has specified for a reparations program is extremely low. But I admire her courage for trying to take leadership on this issue rather than sticking her finger to the wind and proceeding with her program of action.
So let's take your 3 points that you've identified. Well, first, you're saying this is something that's been going on for a long time.
Yes.
This is not a new thing.
It is not a new
And it is seeing fits and starts.
ebbs and flows.
But there
Yeah.
have been many people who've been engaged in thinking about this particular conversation.
Yeah,
Not new at all.
not new at all.
But there is now a bill before Congress to consider a committee that will study a little more. And you've identified 3 points that you think that are important: acknowledgement, redress, and closure. Could you talk about how that bill that's before Congress begins to address at least the first part?
Okay. So the bill before Congress is intended to establish a commission that would study and I presume report on the case for Black reparations, but simultaneously also specify a particular plan of restitution. And I presumably a plan of restitution that could be translated into congressional legislation. Okay. Before the Japanese American reparations program was activated, there was a study commission. It was known as the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. And it performed two tasks. The first was to establish the case for Japanese American reparations. And one of the most important accomplishments of that commission was to demonstrate that American officials knew full well that Japanese Americans did not constitute a national security threat, but they still incarcerated them. So that was the first big task, was to make the case. The second task was to outline a program of restitution. And so I would argue that if we're going to have a program of restitution for Black Americans, we need a similar kind of study commission to be put in place. Now, of course, the danger with any study commission is the question of who is actually on the commission. But that's a risk that has to be taken. So H.R. 40 is a bill that would activate a study commission to focus on Black reparations. And I think that's something that's probably essential as a prelude to
I must
an
tell
active
you that
program.
I had never thought about after our marathon bombings here, we had some restitution that was given to individuals who were impacted. And using your definition, that would actually be reparations as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I actually had never thought about it in terms of that kind. So it was an important part of giving back to those individuals who had been impacted. But definitely, you would see that as being reparations.
That's a form of reparations.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, what's critical is, of course, people who either lost their lives or who were injured in the way in which they might have lost a limb. You cannot restore that. But what you can do is, to the fullest extent possible, engage in an act of compensation. And it's not sufficient to just say, oh, I'm sorry this happened.
Sure.
Yeah.
So the first part of this then is acknowledgement.
Yeah.
And something like H.R. 40 would be taking that first step of at least acknowledging what the problems are, helping us to understand the scope.
So it would at least craft a commission that presumably would be motivated by the acknowledgement.
So you take as you begin to talk about what's involved, you begin to talk not only about slavery, but also about the impact of Jim Crow, the laws, and also post-civil rights issues.
Yeah.
I suspect that you must have some detractors when you talk about this.
Well, I've long had detractors on virtually everything I say, but yeah. Well, people don't typically respond to that point, and they just persist in talking about slavery reparations. So
You mean they don't talk about post-civil rights issues?
yeah, they don't.
Jim Crow?
They really for folks for whom the criticism that they make of reparations relies heavily on centering it exclusively on slavery. Mm-hmm. They don't typically respond to the point that the case is wider than the impact of slavery.
So let's then talk about some of the criticism that comes up with an issue like this, because indeed it's not an easy one to have conversations about. And I suspect that one of those things that people will say was, well, I wasn't there.
Right.
That didn't impact. That I wasn't involved.
Right.
How do we respond?
They, not only do they say that, well, like Mitch McConnell, not only did they say that they weren't responsible or there are no living perpetrators for slavery, they also say that there are no living victims of slavery. And so when you shift the analysis to say that slavery is a dimension of a wider case for reparations, and people like Mitch McConnell definitely were alive during the Jim Crow period, because I was alive during the Jim Crow
Right.
period.
I mean,
Okay,
yeah, and
so-
just think,
so-
I
so-
certainly have that experience of seeing the colored and white bathrooms.
Yeah,
colored and white.
Because we're in approximately the same age. So
Well, I think we might be the same age.
we might be, yeah. So we've seen it firsthand
Yes,
and experienced it. And so when you move the argument to acknowledge that it's part of the story must be the impact of Jim Crow, or events or atrocities that have occurred since the Civil Rights Act, then it's much harder to say that there's no living victims and there's no living perpetrators. But again, I'm not concerned about individuals as perpetrators. I'm concerned about the role of the federal government as the central entity of perpetration.
And so this idea then of it's not about an individual, but that the government, that
Yes.
the activities that the government actually took. But then there's also...
Or the lack of action.
Or lack of action.
Yeah.
But then there's also the matter of, so how far back do we go? Because indeed, as we think about when the country first came into place, as opposed to when slaves first came to this country, I suspect that would be an important question of, so can the government be considered the...
So I personally, I don't think 1619 is the touchstone for this issue. I think it has to be 1776.
About when the government came into place.
When the government came to existence.
Yeah.
And we have a sufficient number of atrocities since then that even if we don't pay attention to 1619 to 1775, we've got a lot to talk about.
Right, 1619 becomes kind of an excuse.
Yes,
Then of,
yeah.
let's actually try to go back that far.
Yeah.
So now we've got this idea of let's have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
Let's then think about the second part of your piece, which your thesis, which is there has to be redress. And for you, that means it's not enough just to say I'm sorry, but it also means direct payment.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
And in the case of reparations for black descendants of American slavery, the payment has to at least eliminate the racial wealth gap, because I view the racial wealth gap as a central indicator or index of the cumulative effects of America's racist history. So that's what I mean by it, is that the payments have to be consonant with a scheme or a system that would eradicate the racial wealth gap.
13% of the population, 3% of the wealth.
Yes, so we should move it at least to a situation in which that 13% of the population has 13% of the nation's
And
wealth.
so as you then begin to think then about what the redress is, again, the conversation becomes that much more complicated of people saying, where is that going to come from? Why should we do that? What does that actually accomplish?
Okay, so here's how I'm going to duck that question.
Okay.
Okay.
You know, my job is just to ask questions.
Now, I'm going to duck it in an honest way.
All right.
But I won't be able to provide the audience with an answer this evening.
Sure.
But in the book that Kirsten Mullen and I have written, the final chapter is devoted to a description of how you might execute a reparations program. And one of the things we talk about is the question of how it would be financed. In addition, I have helped to organize a group that's known as the Reparations Planning Committee, which is a group of scholars who are in the process of also trying to examine or explore how you could best design a reparations program. And that team is also trying to examine the question of how it might be financed. But I will say this, the question of how you will pay for it is always thrown up as an obstacle to any transformative social policy that has some scale. And I think we can demonstrate that it can be paid for, but I can't reveal the full story right now.
I understand. I completely understand. But it's important to actually include that as we're thinking about this issue about redress.
Yeah.
But then you move to the third part, which is closure.
Yeah.
And that closure doesn't mean forgetting, but that closure means that there is an understanding that this thing has happened. Could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah,
please?
so the premise here is that if closure is met, then the victimized community will not make any further claims on the culpable party, any further claims for restitution from the culpable party, unless a new wave of atrocities takes place. But it's a settling of accounts. And I do want to emphasize that that's different from saying that we will now forget that the atrocities ever occurred.
I want to turn to all of you because I know that you're sitting there thinking, and I'm kind of wondering, what are you thinking? There's some microphones that'll come out to you.
Hi.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I can't
My
see
name's
you.
Jory Fortson. I'm a student here at the School of Public Health. I just want to thank you, first of all, for coming today to speak to us. And I did have a question. So earlier you stated that a requirement or prerequisite for a Black reparations program in the United States would necessitate having people prove that they are descendants of enslaved African persons. And so I just wanted to know what would that look like, and how do you envision kind of the feasibility of proving something like that?
So to be precise, certainly the vast majority of people who were enslaved in the United States were folks who are of African descent. But I didn't use that term insofar as I wanted it to be sufficiently general that it would be applicable to anyone who, to anyone who could demonstrate that they had an ancestor who was enslaved, whether or not that ancestor was an African person or not. But it's anyone who now self-identifies as being Black, Negro, or African American. Yeah, so what this really means is that there would be big business for genealogists. And we actually have a discussion in our book about how you could incorporate that genealogical mission into a reparations program so that it would not be something that would be an expense borne by the individuals who are trying to establish that they're eligible for reparations. But there's a wide array of genealogists who specialize in Black American ancestry, particularly in tracing Black American ancestry to the period of slavery. And those are the folks we would draw on because their expertise is first rate.
Thank you very much. I'm going to let you, I can't see so well.
I've
So
got
if
the mic,
you'll-
so I guess I'll use it.
you.
Following on that question, I'm a little confused if the reparations go directly to the people who are descendants who meet the two criteria, self-identification and/or can prove ancestry through genealogy, yet the harms have been inflicted by people through Jim Crow and post-civil rights. And that may not necessarily just be folks who were descendants of slaves. Isn't the universe you're dealing with a much broader universe? And are you not giving reparations to a whole group who may have suffered?
Who am I leaving out?
Yeah.
Okay. That's what we're talking about. Okay.
Yeah.
So-
And if I can just finish, and is that group wide enough so that the distribution would be sufficient to close the wealth gap on a more generalized basis?
So at least 85% of Blacks in the United States are folks who probably have an ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. So that's a very large percentage of the overall population, although circa 1960, it was probably closer to 98 or 99%. So there's been a substantial immigration since the mid-1960s of Black immigrants to the United States. So let me say this first, that one of the anchor points for the question of who should be the recipients of reparations is the denial of the 40 acres to the formerly enslaved. And so it's their descendants who are the relevant recipients of reparations from the United States government. I actually believe that virtually all black people across the globe throughout the diaspora have a reparations claim, but they do not have a reparations claim on the United States government. Maybe the only exception are Ethiopians because they were never colonized. If you're of Haitian ancestry, my view is you have a ferocious claim on the French government, and in fact, Haiti was actually forced to pay reparations to France, which is unconscionable. Okay, if you're from Jamaica, then I think you have a ferocious claim on the United Kingdom, and if you're from Rwanda or Burundi, you have a ferocious claim on Belgium. In fact, we could argue that the genocides that occurred there were a consequence of Belgian colonial policy. So that's my point of view. I think it's very difficult to justify paying reparations to immigrant communities who more or less came to the United States on a voluntary basis, as opposed to a population that was imported forcibly. And so those are some of the ways in which I think it's important to make that distinction. Now, I'm very open-minded about people developing a case for groups that are not included in the particular kind of black reparations plan I have in mind. I welcome people to develop alternative cases, but it's not the case that I've been working on.
Thank you very much. I see more hands. Yeah.
Great. Dr. Darity, thank you. I guess my question is really a question back to the naysayers and those who really, I guess, try to poke the hole in the old reparations movement and argument, is what complicity does the government have, if any, for the enslavement of an entire group of people? What complicity, what responsibility should any organized body have for laws on the books that restrict human progress?
Full complicity.
Full complicity.
Yeah, full complicity.
And so my question then to the to naysayers or to everyone, if there is a precedent that has been clearly established for righting wrongs and repairing damage, why then, when we get to the conversation of those, the only non-immigrant group in the civilized world, if I'm not mistaken, is
the Native Americans.
That's a whole nother two-day conversation.
No, that's right.
But when we get to that conversation, why do we have such cognitive dissonance? And why do we automatically start to assume that other things exist when you have a clear precedent of the contrary?
You want to respond to that?
No, I mean, if you think about it, when you talk about direct payments, a lot of people flinch on that. But if we think about virtually every other significant case of reparations, direct payments are made. So somehow when we start talking about black Americans, there's some kind of different standard that's supposed to be applied. So, is there more than I can say than it has to do with racism, ultimately? I mean, I don't know.
Convenient amnesia.
Yep.
Did you have a question too? Okay. Well, good evening, and I want to thank BU for hosting this conversation because it's really relevant to public health. I had a question that really follows on this idea of why these limitations to people with established ancestry. Because I wonder what the point is for including the long tail of racially based terror and oppression following the end of the Civil War. If your interest really is in compensating people for the travesty of not getting 40 acres and a mule. And it also raises the question that the impact of white supremacy, the ideology that accompanied and enabled enslavement of Africans, extended to many other people, not only people of African descent or not only people descended from African slaves here, but all people of color have paid a price for the ideology that enabled enslavement. So can you just comment on that? And then my next question is, if you're interested in more recent history, why not unbundle it and say the problem of redlining, for example, for which there is, which is an important source of the wealth gap, depriving Black communities of access to home ownership, and also one that's closer to living memory in terms of immediate descendants among us.
Yeah, so I hope I can get to all of this. The issue of redlining is part of the unbundling in our book. It's also part of the unbundling in several papers that I've written on this subject. Yeah. So there are two different issues from my perspective. One is the phenomenon of denial of wealth, and then the other is deprivation of wealth. And by denial, the first significant case in the aftermath of the Civil War is the failure to provide the promised 40 acres and mule. But deprivation is associated with things like, specifically with respect to housing, things like restrictive covenants, succeeded by redlining practices, succeeded in turn by ongoing or sustained credit discrimination in the market for housing. So that's all part of the story. I concentrate most of those actions in the Jim Crow period. So when I start talking about the Jim Crow period as being a significant one that has to be taken into account, that's why. Why do I extend back to the slavery period? Or?
Maybe I'm not articulating it well, but why, if you want to say that it's the whole history that followed, not just the slavery period and ending with emancipation.
Okay, yeah. No, and
why not talk
agree.
about the harms of white supremacy?
Yeah.
And then why then would it be limited only to people who can prove they were?
So let me say that the analysis that I have in mind does extend into the 20th century, particularly because another facet of deprivation of wealth is associated with the wave of white massacres that took place, where not only were Black lives lost, but there was either appropriation or destruction of Black-owned property. And so I think that has to be on the list. Now, why is that not something that's pertinent to more recent immigrants? Well, first of all, there weren't very many more recent immigrants before the Jim Crow period ended. And those who were here were concentrated primarily in New York City and Miami, Florida. Because it's 98 to 99% of the U.S. population up until the 1960s was folks who do have ancestors in the United States. So exposure to Jim Crow very narrowly occurred for folks who were in quotes voluntary immigrants to the United States.
I don't want to get into a debate, but my argument could hold even for the Japanese, for example, that without the enshrinement of white supremacy, the Japanese might not have suffered the fate that they did.
Oh, agreed, but they in fact did receive some form of restitution. Yeah. We could argue about whether it was enough, but yeah. But this goes back to my point that there probably are there's a plethora of groups that probably have a case. It's just not the case I'm working on. And I invite anybody to build the case for other groups. Yeah.
Sure. So there's this question about how many and whom should be involved. There was a question right here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Good evening. My name is Magda Matake, and I lead the Roma program at the Harvard FXB Center. I'm also a descendant of Romani slaves in Romania. So oftentimes when we talk about reparations, we refer to state-sponsored injustices. And looking back at your presentations, and especially the examples of reparations that you provided, I think that you expand the definition not only to state-sponsored injustices, but more so to terrorist attacks and so on. So I wonder what's the added value.
But the terrorist attacks are sanctioned by the state. The state doesn't intervene. The state allows it to happen. If we think about the case of Ocoee, Florida, actually Congress ultimately approved of what had happened in Ocoee, Florida. So the state, the federal government or the governmental entity is ultimately the entity that's responsible for these kinds of events.
But where is your question
so
going?
my question is, why would you expand the war? What is the added value of adding 9/11 or the Boston Marathon or these events as part of the reparations framework? And I'm not arguing that that doesn't need redress, but I see a difference between injustices that are collective and that are sponsored or that are pushed by governments, and injustices that happen perhaps in a way or indirectly with support of the government, but not directly sponsored.
So I agree with you that the sources of the injustice are different in the various examples I provided. But I do find it somewhat interesting that the United States government did choose to provide reparations in the 9/11 case for an assault that the United States government was not responsible for. So from my perspective, that reinforces the justification for reparations for Black Americans, because the injustices there clearly are a consequence of the United States government's behavior.
Dr. Belanoff.
Thank you. No,
No, I think you need the microphone. Yeah.
Thank you. You're very
There
kind.
you go.
Thank you for this. So I'm not going to stand up because that would be a whole ordeal. So on the topic of closure, so we know that historically in the United States, every time that there's a massive wave and effort toward equity for people of color, there's usually a blowback from white people. After the civil rights movement, there was the war on drugs. After Obama was elected, now we've got the red hats, and it goes, certainly the wave of terror post-Reconstruction and all
Although
that.
Obama's election didn't really do much for Black people anyway. But
One could certainly argue. So my question is that should there, baked into the idea of closure, be a sort of massive preemptive, preventative re-education, if you will, of the American public around why this is okay? Because you can better believe that the people with the red hats and beyond will say, all of the arguments that we've heard. So what do you think of that?
yeah, no, I agree. I think it's vital. I think that what's happened thus far is our narratives about Reconstruction and the Civil War in particular have been captured by the United Daughters of the Confederacy for many, many years, to a point that we don't even realize that those narratives have been captured in that way. So it's essential that we alter the way in which we teach American history. And I think that that's a vital aspect of a reparations program.
So the important part here is your first portion of thinking about acknowledgement. Certainly how we teach, what we teach, who we're teaching becomes important.
Yeah.
Sir.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. You began with an argument about the cost of discrimination and in terms of health disparities and the wealth gap. But these things also have costs to us as a society. So the argument is if people of color are experiencing these disparities, there's a social cost. Is there a way of thinking about the idea of reparations and a benefit cost analysis, saying what would we gain as a society by rectifying these issues and thinking about it and looking into the future?
So there's a study from the McKinsey Group that claims that if we eliminated the racial wealth gap, it would provide a major stimulus for the U.S. economy as a whole. I have not been able to find details on the underlying model that they use for that claim. But it would obviate our view that there might be some sort of zero-sum game in process here as a consequence of the provision of reparations. But I don't want to hang my hat on that because I don't know that the evidence is compelling. And I think that this is primarily a moral claim, not necessarily a claim that there would inevitably be some universal benefit for all Americans. What I can say is we can minimize the penalty in terms of lost income or lost wealth to the rest of America in terms of the plan that we have in mind in our book. But I don't want to jump to the stage of saying I'm really confident that there would be kind of this grand multiplier effect for all Americans.
And our last question right here.
So the U.S. government has been identified as culpable because their policies and laws have created the behaviors and beliefs that we see today, which is anti-blackness. And being very clear, all non-black people benefit from this way of thinking. All non-black people benefit from anti-blackness in some kind of way. So what does reparations, not necessarily monetarily, but like social and in terms of beliefs, what does that look like in the everyday for those of us who benefit from anti-blackness beliefs?
Wow. Okay. So I'm not sure everybody benefits from anti-blackness who isn't black, but there might be some black people who benefit from anti-blackness, so that's another story. Okay. There are some. Okay. This gets back to the political question of how you make this happen, and I don't have profound answers to that. I am somewhat more optimistic than I was before. I mean, we've really been waiting 154 years for black reparations, but I'm a bit more optimistic because of the timbre of the conversation now. I mean, I think maybe 2 years ago, I would not necessarily have been invited to be part of this forum to speak on this subject. Yeah,
we may not have actually been thinking about it.
Yeah, so I think that's important. But what I was going to say is it's critical from my perspective that a reparations program be enacted through congressional legislation, which means that there would have to be a sufficient amount of political support across the entire population for that to occur. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be a backlash of the sort that was mentioned a moment ago, but you couldn't have it happen unless there was a sufficient proportion of the U.S. population. I've estimated that, if we could get 40 to 45% of white Americans to support reparations, it would become something that would be feasible. And if that share of the American population supported reparations, then there would have to be some sort of a shift away from raw anti-blackness in some significant way. And so my answer to your question is that the way in which this has to be done must also address the scope of anti-blackness.
I said we might not have had that conversation with you. That's probably not true. We probably would have. And I give a lot of kudos to our dean, Dean Galea, who has encouraged us to have these kinds of conversations. Just immediately after Dean Galea came, we were having some conversations about the impact of Ferguson, and which was kind of unusual to have a conversation like that in a public health school. So indeed, we may have actually been having that. I think we've got a lot of people who are thinking forwardly and who are asking the kinds of questions that our last speaker asked. I want you to know that your book is for sale, because even though it's not out, Amazon has allowed me to pay for it already. So I have it on order. I want to thank you very much for joining us for our conversation today. Have a good afternoon.